Hello, and welcome to another episode of CIO Leadership Live. I'm Mary Fran Johnson, Executive Director of CIO Programs for IDG, and your host for today's conversation with CIO Joel Jacobs of MITRE Corporation. For those of us in the Boston area, MITRE is a familiar and a longtime neighbor. Founded in 1958, this private, not-for-profit organization provides consulting, engineering, and technical research services for many agencies of the federal government. With more than 8,300 scientists, engineers, and technologists on staff in its primary research facilities in Massachusetts and Virginia, MITRE operates 7 federal R&D centers, which work on everything from defense to healthcare to cybersecurity. My guest today has more than 3 decades of experience working both at MITRE and in the consulting and professional services industries. He's worked in a variety of IT and engineering leadership positions at MITRE over the years and has been the CIO since 2009. Joel, welcome. Great to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
Let's start out. MITRE's customer list is quite an alphabet soup of the federal agencies, all the big scary ones, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and so forth. What kind of work takes top priority for you in IT, and how do you organize the IT group to deliver on your mission?
So the IT organization has an enterprise-wide responsibility. It's not focused on individual customers per se.
Mm-hmm.
Our sponsors work directly with the operating units of the company, and MITRE's central IT, corporate IT, has a responsibility for provisioning company-wide. The company itself is organized with different focuses on the individual research and federally funded research and development centers. But as a whole, the company is our mission is to solve problems for a safer world. And that means organizing to the missions of the individual sponsors as well. IT, if you look at the website or hear a description of us operating seven separate centers, it sounds like we're disjoint or under a holding company. But inside the company, it feels much more integrated than that.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know somebody if somebody is working for one part of the organization or one part of the government or another. There's a lot of cross work. There are large technology centers with concentrations of people with a given skills base who are lent to those organizations. And a lot of what we do is capture and reuse the knowledge from one project to another. So IT has a knowledge management responsibility that's enterprise-wide as well.
Okay. Interesting. Every IT organization today seems to be in the midst of some sort of either disruption or transformation, disruption in both the good and the bad senses of all the things that are happening in today's world and with technology. How does that play out at MITRE?
In a couple of ways. Our sponsors have their own interests in disrupting themselves to improve things.
Yes.
So there's a lot of our work has to do with modernization and solving very difficult problems, but also modernizing the way government operates. From the inside of MITRE, there's a greater and greater demand for speed and a recognition that speed shouldn't introduce error, but speed should be responsive to the challenges as a whole. And the expectations keep getting set higher and higher by the pervasive use of technology in the world, not just in corporate entities or in government agencies. There's a great desire to take advantage of what's available, and the expectations are being set higher.
Yeah. Have you found that the changes that you need to make in the IT organization, are they also coming more rapidly? Most IT organizations restructure themselves every few years. It may be that you need more development resources one year, and then perhaps analytics requires starting a whole new function. Talk a little bit about how you've got IT organized today and how that has most recently changed.
IT organized today has been, what we've done over the last 5 years or so is concentrate on recognizing that there are different demands on IT. There are demands for very high SLA, very predictable foundations, and there's also demands for rapid turns of incorporating new technologies or developing new technologies.
Yeah.
And sometimes those feel like they're in conflict in the same organization. So in addition to instrumenting very much a large portion of what we do, we've recognized that we want to have really solid industrial strength foundations, and on top of that, innovate rapidly without breaking that, and it shouldn't be breakable, to bring new value to the user population. So years ago, we'd have a 5-year plan, and we'd follow that 5-year plan, and we'd recognize what moved to the left and what moved to the right in our roadmap. But if just having lived through that, you realize some things never hit the plan, but they turn out to be really important parts of how we operate.
Yeah.
We never had a plan for an iPhone because we never saw it coming. So the rapid turns of technology are such that it's much harder to plan for in very deep specifics. We need to be able to adapt.
Yeah.
And so we're trying things faster, either adopting them or discarding them. We are experimenting with new capabilities or new ideas as fast as we can, and then rolling them out without recognizing that it's a 3-year plan. I know that transforming a network, our entire network, is going to take going to be a long process. But introducing a smaller application capability ought to be really fast. How many apps do you have on your phone? How many of them can bring value in a corporate environment? And how do you make sure that the things that we do bring out really bring value? There's a joke recently at a conference I saw that the first thing that people take off of their phones is the corporate apps, as opposed to the things that they add. So if we're going to bring in innovation and rapidly deploy new capabilities, we need to make sure that they bring value quickly as well.
Well, and you mentioned the big focus on solving problems, and when I think about IT people, they are very methodological thinkers, and they really like to work on a problem until it's just about perfect. Solutions, perfect is the enemy of good, or maybe that's good. That might be the other way around. How do you culturally get that speed built in without making people feel just fundamentally uncomfortable?
I think high speed almost always is going to make at least some portion of the population uncomfortable. If we're holding some portion of the operation to a very high standard of availability and accuracy, then they're going to be uncomfortable if they think that the pace is so great that they can't
they can't do good work.
If they can't keep that level of assurance. So you have to make it safe to have failure, not massive failure, but contained failure within within some level of experimentation. So we can try something new. If it's not going to work out, extract ourselves from it and move on to another possibility. The challenges keep emerging, and if we're just going to, if we don't try enough things, then we are not going to likely find the best solutions.
Right.
So we want rapid turns in the areas that we can, and solid foundations on which they operate. And that combination is a delicate balance, but that's what we try to do.
Okay. Well, and we'll talk a little bit more about all your innovation efforts, because I know that that's a big focus for you as the CIO. But one of the recent changes that we just talked about recently actually concerns your own role. You are Vice President, the Chief Information Officer, and the Chief Security Officer. which is an unusual combo. We run into a lot of CIOs that have taken on different corporate functions, and I know you've done that in your career at MITRE. But talk about wearing both of those hats. And this is not just an interim position. This is something that has been thought through, and I'd love to hear more about that.
So over the years, there's been different schools of thought about where the point of separation of duties ought to be. So the CISO and the IT director need to have a separate point of arbitration, because an IT director is likely to lean more towards functionality or new capability, because that's their mission, and the CISO is going to lean more towards assurance and
Risk
information
management.
protection.
Yeah.
And so somebody's got to be there with the striped shirt and the whistle to arbitrate between them. My role as CSO is broader than cybersecurity. It includes other elements of security for the company as a whole.
The physical security.
Physical security, the security that we need in order to follow government processes and the like. We do have a CISO who answers to me, and he is empowered to throw the red flag if he thinks we are a lot of football analogies, right? It's
well,
Super Bowl
Super
time.
Bowl this weekend and all that.
And now we've just turned off 85% of the people listening, being on the Patriots side. Anyway, so he is empowered to raise his hand if he thinks there's a bias, and he can escalate up to the CEO if that's what he thinks is required.
Okay.
And it's not. There's a no penalty arrangement around that says, if you really believe that we're making a choice that is leaning too far out of where we should be going, then you should say so.
Okay.
But in the meantime, though, a lot of the work in compliance and in cyber risk management really takes a good partnership between IT and information security operations. Our cyber risk program, our cyber security program, is really aligned to balance those risks, and the IT organization has to be geared up and mobilized to both deliver the services but deliver them securely. So as long as we can maintain an effective partnership between those organizations, I think it's an advantage to have a clean understanding of where they meet.
Yeah.
I can imagine the counter argument. I've made that counter argument, and as a consultant, I've made that counter argument for other organizations. But I think it works well in our environment because people have moved from one side of that equation to the other, including me, at different times in their career. So it's been a balance between new functionality and capability and availability and convenience and user experience with security and assurance. We've got a team that works well together.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that your CEO and the board actually, they were deeply involved in this decision. You didn't necessarily volunteer for this, and they said okay. This was something that kind of came from on high as a consideration.
Yeah, it was we have a new CEO. He has a vision for the company. He's been with the company for 25 years.
1991.
So he's very familiar with the company, and he's mobilizing it and reorganizing in ways to, among other things, speed it up. And he wants for the company to be able to move more quickly. And I think he's streamlined some of the executive positions, and I now answer to the chief operating officer, and it was part of that creation of a corporate ops organization that had us relook at many of the different elements of that would be contained within corporate operations. And the result of that analysis across HR, IT, knowledge management, security, finance, and so on, is what resulted in having me take on the CSO role as well.
CSO role. How has that, and you've been doing it for several months now.
Since the summer, yes.
Yeah. How has that changed your day-to-day balance of responsibilities, and what sort of changes has that brought about in either the way IT operates or the way security operates? I mean, are there just more meetings that everybody has to come to?
No, I think so. I think we're getting cleaner lines of decision, and I think that anytime you change the basic structure of a company of 8,000 people, it takes a while to get the new a new equilibrium about expectations and communications lines and the like. And so we're some months into it, so 6 months or so into it, and I think it'll be a continuous improvement process. That said, I think there are places where we have achieved a faster interaction between different organizations because there's a clearer line.
Yeah.
And I
The
think
chain of command is just a lot easier to see up and down.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. We used to be specific. Information security and IT met at the CEO in the past. Now it meets at CSO, CIO, and I'm more intimate with the choices.
Yeah.
But also, because of the previous arrangements, know when we should be bringing even more senior people into a decision because of the risks associated with it.
Interesting. Now, we mentioned you talked about your new CEO. He's been in office since early February, so
That's
almost
right.
a year. And he is a scientist himself with a long history at MITRE. And one of the things that when we talked about this earlier, you said he's been emphasizing the importance of MITRE becoming a learning organization. And how is that different from, I tend to think of research organizations as kind of in a constant state of learning and discovery anyway. So how is this different? I mean, how does the corporate mission, I understand the agility and the faster moving.
Well, I don't think it's a cold start choice. We've had an award-winning knowledge management program for
Yeah.
a decade.
Oh, yeah, you guys have garnered all kinds of innovation awards over the years.
Right.
Yep.
That said, there's his desire to make it really part of our DNA to capture, reuse, learn, adjust processes, reuse project content from one project or sponsor to another, and institutionalize at the next level that it's not just capturing repositories of products and analysis, but also capture and reuse the expertise to apply it and change the processes of the company to be more supportive of continuous learning as an organization. So it's actually a re-emphasis or a next emphasis on what it takes for the company to be continuously improving by learning from its experience. And that's something that the company as a whole is embracing very rapidly. We had foundations where we could capture, but finding and applying and making that part of the expectation that you're going to improve the overall operating process or project delivery process of the corporation. That's a big point of emphasis and has a real value payoff.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine that it is, especially over time, quite a cultural change in that engineers, scientists, technologists, they all love to they like to invent. They like to create their own processes. The idea, I can remember years ago when object-oriented programming started rolling in, and the biggest problem was with developers who didn't want to use somebody else's module because they didn't do it.
Right.
How do you work with that? You don't just put out a memo and everybody cooperates. So what is some of the training and some of the ways you've gotten the organization on board?
So there are people who have been assigned the responsibility at the director level, and including within my organization to participate in the efforts to institutionalize this.
Okay.
And there's some very creative people, but you don't just start with a tool. And we have a lot of tools. In fact, we're trying to streamline some of that in our knowledge management space, where we can focus the energy so that it makes it easier and more streamlined, that the knowledge capture is in the flow. And also in the flow is the search, the quest for what we've already done, or who is the greatest expert on a given topic, and find those, pair them together, and look for the option to reapply to the next capability. I agree with what you put a provocative statement on the table that said developers and scientists and engineers like to create.
Yeah.
But if you've got an 80% solution that's already been executed for one sponsor, or even for an internal process, you're much better off taking it, modifying it, leveraging it, than you are starting from scratch again.
Yes.
And so our ability to do that, we've had considerable success, but we want to stretch it to the next level.
What's an example, like a kind of a practical example of where that has succeeded? Something that you've seen happen in the last year that wouldn't have happened if you weren't taking this approach?
In the last year, I have trouble putting my finger on a specific instance. But over the last couple of years, an example that was connected to the same kind of thinking was we form essentially public-private partnership arrangements where we do shared analytics with outside entities. And in one case, that is aviation safety, where different players in the aviation community, airlines, manufacturers, the FAA, share data, but not with each other, but with us. And we can do analytics on data in ways that they can use to make changes in the air traffic management system to increase safety.
But that don't compromise them by exposing things to competitors
That's
or
right.
other businesses that
That's
they
right.
don't want out.
That's exactly right. Now, that same model can be applied to other areas. And so if you could be talking patient safety as opposed to aviation safety. But the first instance that we were involved in was from one domain, and you want to pick it up and move it, the same model, to additional domains. Don't start from scratch. There are lessons learned from that first set of applications that can be reapplied to other domains effectively. So that's one example. There are other places where we would like to, even in IT, be able to deploy new environments more quickly.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily in the same physical location. They're not necessarily to the same control standards. But if we can reuse them quickly, we have a great advantage.
Well, and it's a terrific mind shift, too, if you get people from out of that not invented here mind shift into a one where they start thinking, it's probably been invented here. Let me look around and see who has this expertise.
Yeah, and I'd go further and say it may not even be invented at MITRE, which means we have to have a good understanding of what's available,
Right.
so that we're not inventing something that is already available in a quicker way.
Fair enough. Other than we've talked a little bit about your new role and about security, what are some of the other important strategic focus areas for you with, well, I guess with both your hats on, but mainly I'm thinking of you as the CIO going into 2018? I always ask CIOs, what are their biggest initiatives? And usually that's the way I get to the things that are keeping them up at night and are very top of mind. So,
Well, for sure, our cybersecurity program is
Yeah.
always going to be top of mind, and especially if in this, the way I'm wearing two hats here. This is something that we have to pay attention to. The threat keeps evolving. The value that we of the assets that we have is high, and it's something that we take very seriously and have for a very long time. But we can't rest on our laurels about that at all. If you stand still in this space, you're going to be in a bad place.
Yep.
But there's other places where we want to bring extra capability to bear, internal to the company and then beyond. So as we've talked about learning organization and what we had called our knowledge-driven enterprise. At its foundation, MITRE is a company of knowledge workers, and our ability to capture and reuse is really high, and we want to be data and knowledge-driven in the choices that we make. But we also need to deliver knowledge and information to all parts of the company at least as fast as they need it.
Yeah.
So over the last few years, we've been putting energy into delivering content and delivering decision-making data in an anticipatory way. So that when somebody, for example, there's several work streams to this, so I'll pick a couple. One is if someone changes their role, including becoming an employee or switching to become a project leader or a new manager, we want to deliver the content that's appropriate to their new role as fast as they can consume it, but not just throw a binder on their desk and say, you're a project leader now.
Not
Here.
just turn on the fire hose.
Right.
Right.
So we've been delivering it in a metered way and in the order that we think is most valuable to them. We have we've been working across the whole corporation, including with the people involved in the learning organization initiatives, to say, let's get a standard version of the basic project leader
The role.
workbook, but not in workbook form, and deliver those in pieces over the course of some number of weeks after they've taken on the role. And we actually have delivered it through our intranet in a way that queues up things that they ought to pay attention to one step at a time. And that's been very well received because it isn't just a fire hose. It's a way of delivering the information that they need at a pace they can consume it.
Like a scheduled watering of the garden, so you don't drown everything in one whole thing. Yes, you had mentioned that the intranet team, and they have a new use of data to do these triggers and alerts.
That's right.
And that sort of.
So I'll follow that thread for a moment. We have a lot of data. Every company does about their environment. And what we'd like to do is, and we've been working at this, is set thresholds and triggers and recommenders based on the data that we have and the uses that individuals demonstrate. If they're interested in X, they may be interested in Y as well. Amazon and Netflix have done this for a long time.
I'm a huge sucker for that on Amazon.
I wonder sometimes why I've got the movies I've got, but
it's just someone told you should have them.
That's right. But we'd like to do that in our corporate operations, not for the corporate operations organization, but as a part of functioning in the company. So if a threshold is noted, either some activity or some lack of activity trigger a reminder or trigger an alert that said something is out of budget or something is being underspent, which may have an indicator of some other challenge.
Sounds almost like a corporate Fitbit.
In a
way.
in a sense, you know,
Yeah.
it's not exactly stand up and stretch, but it's
Yeah.
the idea is to get across the way of triggering action, or at least triggering a look to see if operation to date should indicate something that's several months out,
Yeah.
or at least to take a look at what might be causing something several months out.
Well, I think that's so interesting, too, because we've had a lot of talking and writing over the last few years about predictive analytics and all the different ways to use it. I think you're the first person I've talked with who talks about anticipatory knowledge delivery, and it reminds me of the old saying among marketers that you're trying to give people what they never knew they always wanted. And you're trying to give, and it's to employees. Do you also do this with your contractors and with your customers? Or is this mostly for the internal workforce?
What I'm describing is an application to our internal workforce.
Okay.
But there's no reason why you can't use that as an exemplar for what can be done in external engagement with our sponsors. Our sponsors have some of those same challenges that they'd like to solve. So.
Well, and they hire you to solve their problems, so that's
they
probably,
do indeed.
That's probably a problem for them.
Yeah.
And you do a lot of that with the IT organization. Essentially, I like to call it drinking your own champagne, where you test out things internally that you can share that knowledge with customers.
Right.
Is that the ability to do that and the focus on doing that? Does that continue to grow over time, or is it kind of stabilized and predictable at this point?
I think the topics on which we do that change over time, but sometimes they go in cycles.
Yeah.
We have a robust IT information and knowledge environment, but that carries with it some complexity, but it's also a place to gain operational experience. If we can try something on ourselves, whether it's something in our research program or it's in our direct work program or sponsor work, and we have a test bed of MITRE itself that can inform especially the operational aspects very effectively, we get a lot of questions that are, well, what do you do for yourselves? And we in corporate IT have long stand ready to answer those. It's a regular and recurring interaction with our sponsor community about how we do something for ourselves and whether that can be harvested for their environments.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can't. Their requirements and our requirements are not exactly the same. But often it can be. And so we have regular discussions about things like enterprise systems monitoring tools. How do we get our service assurance, and how do we measure and identify anomalies in performance of given parts of our environment?
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of experience, and we share as we learn, and that in turn has turned into a pretty regular conversation on specific topics in cybersecurity as well. What we do for ourselves and what we've tried on the MITRE environment helps inform what our sponsors could learn from us.
Well, and as we were talking earlier, and I was asking, you've got the 7 federally funded research, the R&D centers, at about what the bulk of MITRE's work falls under national security. So 63% of the work that you do is related to that.
It's in that ballpark,
It's in that ballpark. But I've also heard you talk in the past a lot about the importance of the engaging user experience. And that used to be, especially for companies, defense contractors and companies that work in highly secure environments, that used to be a real problem with as the iPhones arrived, and it became more of a security concern with everyone with their smartphones. Yet you've found different ways to solve that. Talk a little bit about that, how you make the user experience more engaging while still keeping all of your crown jewels safely locked away.
So the primary thing is paying attention to both at the same time. The user experience, it's very easy to say, well, that sounds hard, or it doesn't on the surface meet a specific security control. Therefore, we shouldn't do it. The
Department of No.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So the fact that it's hard needs to be balanced with it's also whether it's valuable, and whether it gives advantages, and whether it makes it easier for people to do the rest of their job. And so we have a very careful balance process that says we're not going to do something that is unnecessarily risky, but we're not just going to start with no and work back from there. So we have a great desire to make it easier to get things done. So in the case of a smartphone, we have containers on the smartphone that are secure. These are commercial products, but we operate them in a particular way that meets our control standards. Where we can have a zone of our network that is less necessary to control for innovation or the like, then we'll configure that. Where we have something that has to have a higher level of control for sensitive information, we'll build an enclave that the data never leaves, and use other techniques to keep it at a higher control level. But to think one size fits all, or if I'm going to do this, it has to apply to every single device in the company or every single piece of data in the company, really locks you into a rigidity of operation that can frustrate the population.
That becomes the reason why they eliminate their corporate apps from their phone. That's why they cut those things off. Well, you would
and recognize that people will find a way to get things done,
especially engineers and technology people.
And you want them to work with the system, not around it. And the more we can accommodate their expectations of how things can work and work relatively simply, the better off we are.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things you said to me about it, if it's not sensitive, we can drive it to mobile.
Right.
So you've got, and what's an example of some applications or employee touch points that you've been able to drive to mobile that you couldn't a few years ago?
So we actually originally took on this topic assuming that we couldn't know what the sensitivity of the data was. So, for example, if somebody sends you something in email, you don't control what that content is.
Right.
So we were extremely careful about what we would allow to go to a mobile device because we started with email.
And email's a mess.
And email is a very difficult thing to to have level of assurance about what the content is. So, starting about a year and a half ago, we actually addressed it from the opposite end of the spectrum and said, all right, what do we know isn't sensitive? And can we provision that to mobile devices? And it turns out there's quite a bit that in our day-to-day activities that we were able to drive to mobile devices because we know by definition it's not sensitive. And that changed our thinking.
What's
And
an example of something like that?
So on my intranet, I have a gadget that we have a configurable, personalized intranet portal. There's a gadget called My Actions, and it's all the administrative things that I have to do over the course of a day, from approving this or that, a purchase request, a
Get up and stretch, Joel.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's actually where we drive that content that I was describing before as well. But in that process, I know that the specific items in there, I know what they are. I know what subsystems the purchasing system feeds it. Now I get an alert on my phone that says you have a purchase rec to approve. I couldn't do that if I could not do that before, and that was kind of a silly boundary that we had imposed on ourselves to protect against other data, not that data.
Yeah.
Another example is filling out my time card.
That's probably
it's a non-sensitive
not
challenge.
mission critical,
Now,
security-wise.
We still have authentication. We still have some boundaries on being able to use the app that allows this, but I don't assume the most sensitive and then work backwards. I am able to deliver non-sensitive things.
Yeah.
In another environment, that may not be as much of a boundary point, but in our environment, it is.
Right.
And the expectations, you and I have talked about this before. The expectations aren't being set by corporate rules; they're being set by
Google and Amazon and Uber and all the things you can do on your smartphone.
Right.
You expect to be able to do them at work.
Right.
Well, one of the phrases I've heard you use about this is that it's about taking the friction out of the workday.
That's right.
Do you see that happening, and you've made a lot of progress in doing that, do you see it happening at your customers as well? Do you find some of the agencies you work with say, they see you approving a purchase rec on your phone, they say, you can do that? How do we do something like that? Is it spreading, do you think?
I think some. I can't speak authoritatively across all of our sponsors, but I think the expectations in just about every environment are rising, and the IT organizations of any entity, any government or company or academic institutions, I think the expectations of flexibility and mobility and location independence are rising everywhere.
Well, and it feels to me like CIOs and IT organizations are just much more attentive to and tapped into the idea of customer engagement, of thinking from the end user point of view. I hear that at our different events across all the different industries.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think in most of the places where people will use examples to demonstrate that in the under the label of digital transformation are mostly retail or individual customer, as opposed to business or business to government.
It's more about kind of the mass
or government,
customization.
or even government to consumer, although there's a retail aspect of that. But I think the expectations are rising across every one of those business interaction models. The expectation is that I shouldn't have to change modes in order to execute what I want to execute.
Right. Yeah.
There's a commercial for one of the prominent vendors where a woman asks a teenager, "What are you doing on your computer?" And she's using an iPad and says, "What's a computer?" And I think that expectation that I shouldn't have to switch from my mobile device to a desktop machine.
Yeah.
I think that's only going to get a more extreme demand signal.
Well, I remember years ago, my kids discovered in our basement we still had a dial telephone down there, and they found it one day, and they brought it. And this is like in the 90s, and they brought it upstairs, and they had it on the table, and they were looking at it, and they kept poking their fingers in the holes, expecting something to happen. And when we showed them, well, you actually pulled it around this way, and they were like, "That's so slow. How could you? How
Exactly.
did you all live before you just could press buttons?" This actually kind of leads us naturally into talking a little bit more about innovation. I find CIOs like to talk about business strategy, leadership, and innovation, and we do a lot of that at our various CIO events. MITRE's mission, though, actually depends on a constant ability to innovate. It's
Right.
not just talk for you guys. It's actually the way you make your living. So talk about your approach to it. Do you take a formal approach or an informal? Do you do both?
So
What's
there's a
your
bit of
setup?
both. There's a bit of both. So I set the stage for what we do in IT by the collaboration we've had with our chief technology officers over the years, and the research program of the company. And so the research, we have a substantial IR&D research program, and some portions of that are software and cyber and IT centric. Some are completely different technology areas because it's for the company as a whole, not for us.
Okay.
It's for on behalf of our sponsors. But we've had a long collaboration with the research program where the research are things that we can apply to ourselves or can inform by applying to ourselves. So among those are rolling out a social network software platform back in about 2009 when the idea of applying it to the enterprise was not really supported by any of the offerings in the world. We actually met directly with Facebook at one point,
Yeah.
and they were
Like,
they were signing up
we're
100
B2C
million
Yeah.
users at a time. Looking at enterprises was not
Right.
not
Yeah.
really on their interest at the time. At any rate, we did it for a variety of reasons, including understanding how interactions happened within an enterprise via social media, and we built one with the appropriate security controls for our environment. But around that same time, we started using a crowdsourcing platform for selecting, proposing, refining, selecting research proposals. It was a partnership between IT and our CTO's office that put up this platform.
And the CTO actually runs the
Research.
R&D, the research. So that's a separate organization
Yeah.
from yours,
Yeah.
but foundational IT supports and enables all that.
Yes, they'll have some specialty IT environments as well, but a lot of what they do rides our basic infrastructure. So, what we did was started using this crowdsourcing method so that people could collaborate to refine these research proposals.
Yeah.
Then we applied it within IT as well. We run a much smaller innovation program where people can propose ideas, and we'll do campaigns, a campaign for a few weeks at about a couple times a year, and say, here are the themes that we're interested in. Yeah.
Is this your Innovation Ignition
Yeah.
program?
Yeah.
Okay, and these are actually involved, like, it's a grants process, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of.
It's small test amounts, but
Yeah.
We determine whether there's something from that is worthy to put into our service development process and deployment. And we started doing this within the IT organization, then we expanded it to include. There's a self-organized group of millennials across the company who were looking for ways to, frankly, get attention on their ideas about how we could change the way the company works.
Yeah.
So they're now invited into this process as well, and so anybody can propose, although we also target places where we think is going to be a effective way to find good ideas to try.
Yeah.
And that in turn has made adjustments to production operations, where we've rolled out a service that was based on an idea that was started with this ideation platform, and then ultimately selected within a theme that we thought was going to be important. Some of our mobility work started there too.
Yeah. Is that what the MITRE at Work app, didn't that start in your innovation program?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was connected there, yes. And the idea of that was exactly what we were talking about before, which is the non-sensitive items that we could deliver to mobile devices with less concern.
I love the sound of that, a self-organized group of millennials. Do they give themselves a name? I remember my son works at Google, and they call the new employees Nooglers, because everybody's got a Google kind of moniker that gets put on them. Did this group of millennials, how many of them were there? Did they give themselves a name?
They
did they have a president?
I don't know that they have a president. They certainly have people who are the leaders, the spokespeople. Yeah, they're called Next Up.
Next Up. Oh,
and
okay.
And it started actually.
That's sending a message up the management chain, isn't
yeah,
it?
And
yeah.
It started in the organization that our new CEO ran some years back, and it was in one pretty large chunk of the business, but it was not universal when it started. But within a year or two, there's a sort of self-organizing community across the entire company, and it's early career professionals and extended into interns and co-ops as well. And they're amazing, frankly.
Yeah.
There's a level of energy and interest and the like. And we talked before about taking friction out of the system. There's a place where you don't want to add friction, where they are,
because they'll hack around it.
Yeah, and they'll just get frustrated. Yeah. So our desire is to mobilize that their interests and their capabilities in ways that accelerates rather than causes friction.
Yeah. Well, and as a research organization, of course, you did a lot of research on what millennials were looking for and how to acquire them and retain them and all that. What are some of the things you've discovered as a leader about working with our younger generation in the workforce and what they're after and some of the kind of surprising findings? Because everybody assumes a lot of things about millennials.
I think it's easy to paint with a broad brush.
It is. And I'm always reminding when I hear CIOs starting to grouse about millennials, I have to remind them those are our kids you're grousing about. Because if you're a baby boomer, your children are millennials.
It's worth noting that they are the workforce now. And
they are.
So the idea that they're something other than the workforce doesn't make any sense anymore.
Right.
It probably never made any sense.
No.
I think what we've found, we've done different engagements to try to understand how to adopt the company to others as opposed to that make them fit the traditional views of the company's operation. I think some of the experiments pilots that we've run with millennials have informed how we configure collaboration spaces and how we configure lab spaces more effectively. And there are times when we've actually made specific design changes in our space standard based on the experience we've had with millennials. A few years ago, we had a subset who worked in my organization where we had a lab space where, and they each had their own projects to execute, but we gave them the flexibility to configure it any way they wanted. And this was over the summer, and so there were co-ops and interns and some early career staff working together. and they rearranged it very differently than I could have imagined. And we actually had time-lapsed cameras to see how the space was changed, and that in turn gave higher emphasis on collaboration spaces than on solo offices.
Nobody wanted cubicles.
I didn't. I don't know that was explicitly an option, but that in turn also said the virtual environments for collaboration had to change.
Of course.
So we configured the arrangements around those as well. I think the collaboration platforms that I talked about before were refined some by that, and the integration of virtual and physical collaboration spaces became more obvious that we had to make it simpler to interconnect them.
Yeah, it becomes hard to tell after a while which one is driving the other.
Right.
It's, the ability to virtually collaborate may be shaping. I don't imagine it's just happening in a MITRE. It's probably at all sorts of companies.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Because you made the point earlier that the way that millennials do want to work differently together, but that actually all age groups and generations in the workforce today do as well.
I think
there are
there's
some
data
universal
to support that.
things. Yeah, some.
Yeah, I mean the saturation of some social networks or social media platforms by millennials is followed directly by the next wave, older and younger, who are also adopting those platforms, and there's clearly been waves of that over the years. But I think the idea that their expectations are changed by their experience, and they come into a corporate environment, and suddenly there's a lot of boundaries, and if we can keep the important ones and reduce the unimportant ones, it works out better for everybody.
Well, and I've heard other CIOs say that one of the things they like about bringing in interns and other, the first generation workers essentially is that if they notice the boundaries, they don't tend to respect them very much, and that they also just don't know what all the hidden bureaucratic walls are. So they just tend to kind of crash through into areas, which can be alarming and refreshing and all that for other workers.
Yeah.
Are there specific programs that you have to retain more millennials at MITRE, or is it more on a case-by-case basis?
There are some specific programs that are intended to engage them more.
Okay.
And I don't mean it's not really targeting, but to make sure that opportunities are available.
Okay.
This isn't in my organization, it's in our research work program. There's early career researchers, and there's extra attention brought to make sure that we're getting people with research interests earlier in their career engaged in the program.
Well, and to go even earlier, I know MITRE has a long history of being involved in various STEM events to get kids much earlier into the school system interested. Do you still do a lot of specific programs around that?
We do. Part of that is the kind of community engagement that events like Girls Who Code and other venues where we can, in a reasonable way, offer access to our facilities for an evening event or mass innovation nights. That's here with the Commonwealth. Okay. And but we try to reach as broadly as we can. Similar events in Virginia as well, and at some of our site locations.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we are just about out of time, and I'll ask you one of my favorite last questions that I like to wrap up interviews with is to ask for a great piece of advice. So when you think about early and mid-career professionals in IT and all the uncertainty about what lies ahead, if you imagine yourself back 20, 25 years in your IT career, what would you advise to people kind of coming up the ladder? What sort of approaches should they take to developing themselves as leaders?
Be willing to take a risk.
Mm-hmm.
Even in a company like MITRE, who is, our job is to help the government reduce its risk. I mean, that's one portion of what we do. If you have an idea that you think is important and brings extra value, take the risk. Back it. I've learned that it's easy to say no, as we talked about before. It's easy to find the flaws in something or an approach or an idea and say, oh, well, it won't work because of X. Advocacy of something like that is a risk of its own.
Yes.
Going on record to say, this I think is going to be really important.
Yeah.
And there are people who have told me things that I thought were just not very, I thought they were crazy. Crazy is a little strong. I just thought they were wrong. And they were right. And they advocated for something that really did matter. And were willing to take me on to say, no, this is really important. This is really going to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I didn't see it, and they did.
That's
and
great.
So
that's great.
Be willing
advice.
to take a risk.
Yep. I ask a lot of CIOs this question, and one of my favorite answers, and a lot of them say this, is the courage of your convictions, which is another version of that. Speak up and the speaking truth to power thing, which a lot of times they say, I wish I had started doing that earlier in my career. So thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's really been a great conversation. And I want to thank our listeners, for everyone who tuned in. We will, if you are tuning in at the very end and thinking to yourself, I wish I could hear this whole conversation all over again, we will have this up on our site on CIO.com tomorrow. And we post an audio podcast of my interview with Joel on iTunes and Google Play and SoundCloud. And we'll be back again with the next episode of CIO Leadership Live in the first week of March, when I'll be talking with CIO Mojgan Lefebvre from Liberty Mutual. So thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you again to my guest, Joel Jacobs, the CIO of MITRE Corp.